job. And so these students have worked very hard not only to find their voice, but to find a story that in 5 minutes to tell you about their research in terms that are not, you don't need to spend months in the lab to figure out what they're talking about. So we're going to actually start with our first speaker, who's a student, a scientist, and a storyteller. He is from the Department of Geography, our first year student. Please welcome Tang.
If you spin me in a circle, no matter which direction I eventually end up facing, in less than a 5-mile walk, I'll be on some farmer's property. As I stand and observe that property long enough, I will observe that farmer fertilizing their fields. Any fertilizer that isn't absorbed by the soil will eventually be washed off by the rain. Now, this fertilized water will make its way into a stream, which will find its way into the Great Miami River, which will find its way into the Ohio River, which will find its way into the Mississippi River, which drains into the Gulf of Mexico. Now, it turns out that fertilizer isn't just good for fertilizing crops. It's also good for fertilizing algae. And when algae gets fertilized, it creates these massive algae blooms, very similar to the one that you see on the screen. Eventually, the algae has to die, and it will be decomposed by bacteria. The process of decomposition requires a lot of oxygen. So the bacteria will actually pull all the oxygen out of the water to further the process. Now, if you happen to be anything in the water, say a fish that needs oxygen, you will suffocate. And not just you, but all of your fish buddies with you. You'll be pushed out by the tide onto the shore, where you'll be eventually discovered by somebody. We call these areas dead zones. In 2017, the dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico was the size of Connecticut. And this isn't just a Gulf of Mexico problem. It's also an Ohio problem. In 2015, a 500-mile stretch of the Ohio River was declared a dead zone. Now I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, it's those farmers. We have to stop the farmers. This isn't that kind of story. Instead, this is the story of a boy from California who moves to Ohio to study beavers. Now, why beavers, you might be wondering? It turns out that the dams that beavers build actually filter out 2 nutrients that algae needs to grow: phosphates and nitrates. Every day that I'm able to, I'm out there walking the streams of Southwest Ohio. Now, the streams in Southwest Ohio have 2 different personalities. Some streams are very pleasant. You hear the birds chirping, the sound of nature envelopes you, and you almost feel like grandma is waiting for you at the end of the day with a hot cup of cocoa for you. Other streams, however, are downright hideous. They want to fight you every step of the way. And after an hour of walking through those streams, you realize you've only made it 100 feet. You look behind you, and the undergraduate research assistant who your department has so graciously given you is now neck deep in the water. And you realize they're all of maybe 5 feet, 2 inches if they're wearing the right shoes, and you have to fish them out of the water. Regardless, the important thing at the end of the day is if I find a beaver dam or not. Is it disappointing if I don't find a beaver dam? Yeah, I'm a little disappointed. I feel like I've wasted 8 hours of my day. But other days, you find the behemoth. And you take that information and you enter it into a species distribution model. That's just the name of the model that I am building that will tell me where beavers like to build their dams. Our early data tells us that beavers like to build their dams in what we call perennial low gradient streams. That's just a fancy way of saying a stream that always has water flowing through it and that isn't very steep. If it turns out that beavers build dams where we need them to build them, we can relocate beavers into those areas, and we now have a low-cost solution for the problem of dead zones. And in case you're wondering, not more than 10 feet from where I am standing in this photo is where I had to fish out my undergraduate research assistant. Thank you.
Please, close your eyes and imagine that you are in your house. Everything that you think makes you who you are is in your house. It could be your family, it could be your friends, maybe your favorite food. Now what if there was more that made you who you are? What if the mailman dropping off a note from a loved one, or the birds chirping outside, or the sun bursting through the window of a bright day was also included in this house? Okay, please open your eyes. Our ancestors depended on nature for survival and for psychological needs. But now, our evolution has brought us increasingly indoors. As we spend more time inside today, we get more and more distant from nature. We still depend on nature for our survival needs, and we get psychological benefits from nature, but our distance is increasing, and we're losing some of those benefits. This contributes to environmental issues we face today, such as climate change and habitat destruction. But as we spend more time in nature, we are more likely to participate in environmental behaviors. Now, what does all this have to do with the self? Well, I'm going to answer that question a little further in this presentation, but I want to go into a little bit of the self now. The self is studied extensively in philosophy, theology, and psychology. In psychology, there are three forms of self: the independent self, the interdependent self, and the metapersonal self. I'm going to go into detail of these concepts of self in the next slides. Here's me, and I'm surrounded by what I'm calling my house, that little red circle. Now I'm looking a little small and lonely, so let's give me some people to interact with. Here's what I would look like if I was the independent self. I'm still in my house, but I'm still all alone, and people are outside. This kind of reflects the separate nature of the independent self. The self is contained and separate from other people. Here I am living as the interdependent self. I'm living with my family, my mom, my dad, my two sisters. And the interdependent self focuses on close groups of people to the individual, such as family and friends. And here's the metapersonal self, or as I like to say, the mega self. I am living with not only my family, but I'm living with the mailman, the sunshine, and the birds that we talked about earlier. Now, I wouldn't literally recommend living in a house like this. I don't think I could live with my older sister in her extra long showers again. But imagine what it would be like if we included nature in our concept of self. How would our behavior change? This is an actual concept in psychology called nature connectedness. And it's the extent which we include nature in our concept of self. Nature connectedness has been shown to improve psychological states, such as increased efficiency of cognitive processing, physical ailments, such as reduced pain and increased healing time, or decreased healing time, and also increases spiritual well-being, such as appreciation of what we have and happiness in the workplace. It also increases pro-environmental behavior. So that's what the self has to do with environmental behaviors. The metapersonal self is connected to nature, and being connected to nature increases pro-environmental behavior, such as sustainable shopping and reduce car use and reduced energy use. Here's me, literally me again. This time it's me. I am in Yosemite National Park, and I was completely blown away by this place. I lost myself in the immensity, the vast cathedrals of stone, streams, and trees that this place was. I felt my metapersonal self active. I felt nature take me away and simultaneously fill me with its glory. Now, please close your eyes again. Imagine you are back in your house. Everything that makes you who you are is in your house with you. I would like for you to open up your windows and let nature in. Or better yet, go outside and enjoy a refreshing spring breeze. Thank you for your time.
So I do have to apologize because I need to start my talk off by sharing some scary facts. It's estimated that today, 117 people are going to die by suicide. And our ability to determine who will die by suicide has not improved in the past 50 years. And 25% of those with eating disorders will attempt suicide at some point in their life. These facts illustrate several points. One, clearly suicide is a prevalent and unsolved problem. And there seems to be some sort of association between eating disorders and suicidal thoughts and behaviors, or suicidality. Let me help illuminate these facts, though, by sharing a personal story. As mentioned before, I spent 2 years working at a residential eating disorder facility where I had the incredible experience of watching these strong, determined women fight back against their mental illness. Unfortunately, one of these young women felt so hopeless about her situation, she attempted suicide. And as someone who had interacted with her just hours prior, I felt completely lost and so confused. And beyond the despair that this young woman was feeling, her clinicians, her family members, her friends, the other patients were totally heartbroken because they didn't know how to best support her or to prevent this from happening again. Because the problem is, we don't know a lot about the relationship between eating disorders and suicidality. So how are we going to treat something or prevent something if we don't know what's causing what? That would be like showing up to a blazing house fire with the potential consequence of death and not knowing if we should be aiming the water at the flames or the smoke. But there is hope. You see, by investigating the relationship over time, or the longitudinal relationship between eating disorders and suicidality, we can begin to look at this relationship the right way, and we can identify better treatments to reduce suffering. Me personally, I'm interested in suicidal thoughts, or suicidal ideation. And so my thesis looked at the longitudinal relationship between eating disorder symptoms and suicidality. Specifically, I was interested to see if someone was engaging in eating disorder symptoms at one time point, if we would see an increase in thoughts about suicide a week later. I also looked at it the other way, where I was curious to see if someone was having thoughts about suicide, we would see an increase in eating disorder symptoms at the following week. And then finally, I investigated if there was a bidirectional relationship, where these two variables were influencing each other equally. So the results from my thesis highlighted two crucial points. One, I found that thoughts about suicide predicted the engagement of eating disorder symptoms at the following time point. I also found that within my sample of eating disorder patients, patients, 50% of them endorse having thoughts about suicide. So that sounds like something we should be evaluating. However, research indicates that healthcare providers are only evaluating for thoughts about suicide and suicidal behavior in less than 50% of their eating disorder patient cases. So that is something that needs to change. Going back to my finding that suicidal ideation can predict future engagement in eating disorder symptoms, I think this highlights a novel reason for why relapse rates might be so high in these individuals. So imagine that you're having really scary thoughts about suicide and you want to avoid them. And let's say that you avoid them by engaging in eating disorder symptoms. Well, if you go to treatment for your eating disorder, that treatment's going to be really great at targeting the eating disorder symptoms, but it's not getting at the flames of this problem. And so someone who then is recovering from their eating disorder, if they have an increase in these scary thoughts about suicide, they're going to be more likely to revert back to their eating disorder symptoms as a way to cope with that experience. My research and other research so far has only allowed us to have a small peek into this relationship so far. And there's still a lot of work that needs to be done. But my hope is that you guys today, from my talk, have learned that there's a problem here and there's a problem that needs attention. And with that attention, we can help develop a deeper empathy for these individuals, secure more funding, and develop better treatment. So hopefully, as a society, we can help these individuals that are being consumed by this fire by identifying what are the flames of the situation and using the best treatment to target those flames. Thank you.
Thank you. Big data. It's like an ocean of information that keeps rising. To quote Bennett Moore, every 2 days we generate as much data as we did from the beginning of time until the year 2000. That's right, every 2 days. Many of us can probably relate to the next slide. Facebook, Twitter, social media, YouTube, Google, you name it. To predictions from the IDC, the International Data Corporation, also show this exponential growth of data. We keep generating data on and again. Every action you take that involves technology leaves a digital footprint. We're going to look at 2 examples of companies that use big data. Carfax. Carfax is a great example that stores over 13 billion documents to store vehicle history reports to connect potential buyers like you and I to used vehicles. Comcast is another example that processes over 100,000 operations every single second. Can you imagine? 100,000 operations per second. That's big data. So understanding big data. What is big data? They can be defined as massive amounts of large data sets, extremely large data sets that are analyzed to discover patterns and trends. And oftentimes they're used for predictive analytics, human interaction, marketing, advertising, and things like that. So big data can also be described in terms of volume, variety, and velocity. Also, you can use veracity. But a lot of times the volume of the data determines whether it can be considered big data or not. That brings us to the key question of my discussion today. What technology would you use to store over 250 billion records? That's a lot of numbers. Well, the short answer in the context of our discussion today is to use NoSQL databases. But coming back, what is a database? Simply said, a database is an organized collection of information that can be stored for easy information retrieval and access or management. There are 2 types of databases that we're going to be looking at today. Relational databases. Relational databases are typically based on a table system. Think of rows and columns. This is a great example of a student table. You have rows and columns showing what is stored. There are several examples of relational databases out there. MySQL, Oracle, those are the big names some of us are familiar with. NoSQL databases, on the other hand, they're different from relational databases because they store data typical of big data, unstructured data. And those ones typically have a flexible schema. So the difference, and so like I said before, that the question, what technology would you use to store big data? 250 billion records, we're talking about NoSQL databases. Well, let's try to understand that. Two reasons why we're using NoSQL databases that I'm discussing today: scalability and reduced cost. Scalability. NoSQL databases have a horizontal scale-out model, which means to increase the capacity of your data, to increase the capacity of a system, you're adding nodes. As you can see from the picture, in a relational database, which is the vertical scalability, to increase the capacity, to increase data demands, to handle more data demands, you're adding resources to just one system. So you're adding resources and adding resources to just one single computer, one single server. It gets to a point that a limit is reached and you can no longer add anything. On the other side, NoSQL databases, you can add resources, you can add cheaper computers. You can keep adding computers to form a cluster. As you add those computers, you increase the capacity and the throughput and performance of the overall system. Thereby, no matter the amount of data that keeps coming in, you can still handle the demands. This is a summary of relational databases and NoSQL databases. You have the table system, like I discussed before, and you have NoSQL that can handle different types of data. Reduced cost. As you imagine, when you have a vertical scale-up model, you're just trying to increase the capacity of one system. It gets to a point that the engineering costs keep increasing because you're just trying to add, say, a processor and CPU and all these different things to just one system. So in NoSQL databases, you have a lot of reduced engineering costs. As I conclude this discussion today, I would like us to think about, how are you generating big data? What action are you taking that leaves that digital footprint that creates more data? And also, what could big data do for you? Thank you.
Every semester, I have to fill some teacher evaluation surveys out for specific classes I took. I am required to take these surveys because if I want to check my final scores, right? So there are some skills you might have noticed, from strongly disagree to strongly agree. People might think those skills are evenly distributed. So for me, I think it is really hard to present a liker skills for original data in a linear way. And if it doesn't show in a linear way, how do we know the distance from disagree to agree or from strongly agree to agree? So what if this happened? Strongly agree, agree. Disagree, strongly disagree. What if this happened? This is a big problem. So using rush technique can help us to solve this problem. And your rush technique can show a clear person and item map. For example, here is a right map about self-efficacy survey. On the one hand, it's person column with axes. The higher the axis located, the higher the person may have more confidence. The lower the X located, they have less confidence. And on the other hand, it's about the items with Qs. The higher the Q located, it's harder to agree with. If it's lower located, then it's easier to agree with. So using rush techniques showed a clear linear way of person-item map. So we can also use rush analysis to predict students' progress. We can use the same difficulty item to different time periods and to the same group of students. For example, we can give a 12-item test
to a grade 5 in spring 2018, and we can give a 16-item test to grade 6 to 2018 for when this same group of students become grade 6. So using rush analysis, we can just predict their progress without changing the test difficulties, and we can still get the clearly progress that students will have. So what should we do if data is missing in research? It is very common, like the person just don't feel like to answer the question, or they just jump that question. What should we do? If we just abandon the data we collected, it will be cheating, right? We don't want to do that. So using rush analysis can just analyze the data without deleting or changing the data, still get a clear item-person map. So in a nutshell, rush analysis is really easy to use, to learn, and most importantly, it has been widely used in the field of education, medical, business, and other fields need to use rush to deal with data. Thank you.
In our day-to-day activities, we touch polymers, starting from our water bottles, which we carry around, down to the plastic bags you go shopping with, and also the dashboards in your cars, the phone cases, even your lunch boxes, unless, of course, like me, you use a lunch box that actually has, or it's made of glass, but then it has a plastic cover in there. So we are not exactly exempted from the usage of polymers. So, with that being said, polymers are all around us, and over 50% of the world's materials are made up of polymers. That leaves us with the question, what is a polymer? So, if you've seen a child play around before with Lego bricks, stacking them one on another to form like a wall sort of structure, then it gives you an idea of what a polymer is made up of. And now I've implicated everyone because you're looking at the screen, so you have an idea of how polymers are made. So, polymers are actually defined in the simplest terms as molecules that are made up of repeating units, actually many repeating units called monomers. So monomers add up one to another and form sort of like a chain structure, or like people holding hands. And so when they add up that way, that chain formed is what you call a polymer. The order in which these monomers add up one to another, the length of the chain formed, and the type of monomer used actually defines the specific property of a given polymer. So, 2009, 2 articles were published in Forbes where 2 researchers were being reported to have been able to make some self-healing polymers, but then they were able to do this, and they could be able to adapt this into paint for cars. So, interestingly, this polymer had 2 downsides. Number 1, they used some chemicals that they isolated, specifically chitin from crustaceans, and that involves lobsters, crayfish, and crabs. And secondly, these specific materials can self-heal only once. So that means if you had a car that was painted using this paint that can self-heal, and it's been scratched or it's kind of chipped, it can self-heal only once, and that spot loses its self-healing ability after that. 1 week later, a guy published an article in New Atlas, and he spoke about what they did. He praised their work. However, he ended his article in a sarcastic way, and he said, we hope that by the time we're done making cars that have self-healing paints, hopefully we'll have enough lobsters to go around for everyone. And I thought to myself, oh, poor lobsters, why do we keep involving them in our own businesses? So, introducing reversible addition fragmentation chain transfer polymerization, otherwise called raft polymerization. It's just a technology we use today to make these sort of polymers, and I know they look beautiful, they look colorful, but it's not about the aesthetics. They come in different sizes, in different shapes, in different structures, and these polymers actually come in that way because we carry out specific tests. So it's not about the aesthetics, like I said, the shapes and sizes depends on what we want to do with them. So these polymers have exhibited some interesting properties. They have excellent malleability, creep recovery, and as well, we've observed electrical conductivity. Can you imagine a polymer material conducting electricity? Put it this way, can you imagine your car tire being able to self-heal not just once, but multiple times after it's been punctured? This is a material that we made in our lab, and it's been made to undergo a specific test. Like anything that is special to you that breaks, the first instinct that comes is you try to put it together to see if it has any chance of survival. So we cut this material with a blade, then we put it back together. We want to see what it's going to behave like. We put it back together because we use RAPS technology to make it. This material self-heal, but then we want to verify and see the efficiency of this healing, so we pull this material apart until it breaks. So when we pull it apart, we in fact realize that it broke somewhere else. And that makes it interesting. This tells us that the part where we actually cut this material before, and it actually has been deformed, that part healed and became stronger than every other part in the material, and that makes this really interesting. So, two problems I mentioned earlier, that those other researchers in 2009 were able to make material that were depending on lobsters or crayfish just so they could extract chitin. This material does not depend on that. Also, this material can self-heal multiple times. That means the problem experienced then is no longer a problem now. It simply shows you that we're making progress in the field. Introducing Einstein and Millikan. These two gentlemen received a Nobel Prize for a work they did basically associating to the photoelectric effect. Fun fact, they were not the first to observe this effect, but they were able to express an interest because the first time it was observed 33 years earlier to when they won that Nobel Prize. So for them to have expressed interest in something that was observed way long before their time, and people would have termed it old knowledge, but they expressed interest and it got them a Nobel Prize. We are not without fault. Our material has its downside. So I mentioned earlier that our materials have electrical conductivity. You can imagine a polymer conducting electricity. It is supposed to be an insulator, like prevent flow of electricity. So with that being said, with that material that has electrical conductivity has less or poor self-healing ability. But we know that just because something works or works a little doesn't mean we cannot make it better. So we constantly keep looking for ways to make this better. And so we are looking for collaborators like this, people that have the answers. Your answer may be actually the missing piece to the puzzle we're trying to solve. So this is Thomas Edison. We know him as the guy who invented the light bulb. But what we don't know is the guy who actually saw what he did, supported him, and funded his project. And that guy is J.P. Morgan. So J.P. Morgan was a philanthropist and also some guy that was in the banking industry then. And so he helped him, supported his project, and led him through. So he needed that support in order for the light bulb to become what it is today. What do we need today? We need you to believe in what we are doing, because it gives us strength and helps us to continue. And also, we need the appropriate support, and with constructive collaboration, we can be able to bring our dreams into reality in no distant future. Self-healing materials are no longer a myth or story. They are real, and they are here to stay. Thank you.
School with 500 students. In a school this size, we could expect that 100 of those students would be suffering from a mental illness. Of those 100, 60 would not have access to treatment at all, and of those who do have access to treatment, 28 will only have access through limited resources available at their school. So what this means is that in a given classroom, you would have 1 out of every 5 students who is suffering from a mental illness and has no access to treatment. So what this results in a classroom is having a handful of students who have a hard time concentrating because of really difficult thoughts, emotions, or impulses that they have a hard time coping with. And this is a really distracting learning environment for the student, for their teachers, and possibly for their peers. Regardless of this, we expect that every student will graduate ready for jobs, college, and beyond without giving a lot of additional resource for those children who do have a mental illness. It's like we're giving a gardener an assorted bag of seeds with different needs for water, soil, and light, and expecting for them to come up with a batch of tomatoes with only a box of dirt. So what can we do about this to better support our schools in meeting the needs of children with mental illness? First, we need to better invest in the mental health and well-being of teachers. Why would we invest in teachers? Teaching is continually reported as one of the most stressful jobs with the highest rates of stress, turnover, burnout, anxiety, and depression. 2/3 of teachers report symptoms of mental illness directly related to stress from their job. Teachers are really stressed out, and that's a problem because when teachers are stressed out, it affects how their students achieve academically, it increases more problem behaviors in the classroom, and overall just creates a tougher environment. One way to support this is to offer mindfulness training for teachers during their professional development time at school. What this training does is give teachers better tools for coping with their difficult emotions and difficult situations. The results of these trainings are teachers that are more confident in their skills, have better academic outcomes in their classroom, and less problem behaviors. Most importantly, teachers who go through these types of training have better one-on-one relationships with their students, and this is key. For students who are at a high risk of developing a mental illness, one of the most protective factors at school is having just one adult in the building that they feel really knows who they are and cares about them. Just one adult. So by investing in teachers' mental health and well-being, we can better treat students who are suffering from a mental illness at school. In addition to this, we can partner schools with community organizations that have expertise and resources to meet students' need with mental illness. As an example, there was a Chicago public high school that was reported as failing according to its state standards. What this school did was paired up with a nonprofit who specialized in social work case management and providing mental health counseling services. This organization was able to provide individual and group counseling both during the school day, after hours, and on the weekends for students who have mental illnesses, all students in general, and their families. Additionally, this group worked with teachers to come up with individual care plans for students who are suffering from a mental illness in the classroom. After 3 years of this partnership, the school reported 10% higher graduation and attendance rates. And overall, the students were achieving more academically and more socially well. What this enabled the community to do was to pool together resources and create a shared vision for meeting the needs of children who have mental illness in their community. So the next time that you go to vote for a school board official, or attend a PTA meeting, or give feedback to a local nonprofit, I ask you to think about the many needs that students have who are suffering from a mental illness, and do what you can to support their teachers and to support community partnerships that can better meet their needs. This will result in students who are more able to achieve in the classroom and are ready for college, jobs, and beyond, and to make a positive impact on their community. Thank you.
So one day I was walking towards Armstrong Student Center, and there was a guy walking towards me who was waving his hand. There were a bunch of people around me, so I wasn't really sure if he was waving at me or somebody else. So I looked at his face, and I recognized it was my friend. Not exactly my friend, but you get the idea. But to think about what happens between the moment I decided I need to look at his face and the moment I recognize him as my friend, there are actually hundreds of questions you can ask yourself. So did I look at his face at once, or did I go from his hair, move on to his eyes and nose and mouth? And when exactly did I recognize him as my friend? In cognitive psychology, there's a term, hierarchical visual processing, that we use to describe such situations. So our eyes and our brain need to work together to combine information from multiple sources to make a judgment or to make a decision. questions we ask ourselves can be categorized into two groups, architecture and stopping rule. So architecture is used to describe how is the order or what is the order of processing of multiple sources. So did I see the face or everything on the face at the same time, or did I process them one after another? The stopping rule describes when we need to make a decision or when we need to stop. So for a really, really close friend, I might be able to recognize him as soon as I see his eyes. But if I happen to know a pair of twins, I might have to examine every single detail on their faces to tell which one is which. The research in this field is usually done in such a way that psychologists build models, mathematical models, of all the combinations of architectures and stopping rules. And then they fit the models to empirical data to figure out which one of the models describes the data best. It is common practice for psychologists to start simple, but for us, it's more like putting blinders on horses or even people. And we don't want to do that. So in our lab, we're trying to replicate the real world better by taking off the blinders. And we're doing that by presenting pictures to both of people's right visual field and left visual field. One thing we need to know is everything on our right visual field goes to our left hemisphere first, and everything on our left visual field goes to our right hemisphere first. And what makes the question more important and also more interesting, but also more complicated, is our two hemispheres actually do not work the same way. So our right hemisphere is more sufficient processing global information, like a face, and our left hemisphere is more sufficient processing local information, like eyes or nose or the mouth on a face. So we think it will be interesting to look at both hemispheres and see what happens when both of them are involved, but might be at different stages of processing. By doing this, to answer the question we're trying to ask, we need to collect both behavior data of how fast people make responses to pictures from different conditions, but we also need to collect brainwave data to help us understand what is actually going on in people's brains when they're making specific judgments. The last but maybe the most important question to ask is, why do we care? Why are we even doing research on this? So the processing I talked about is probably natural to most of us, and it's maybe too natural for us. We're not even aware of it. But unfortunately, it's not the same for everybody. So think of people who cannot see, and think of how our research can help them. Once we have all the questions in this field answered, we will be able to program the procedure in a microcomputer and maybe implant it in blind people's head. And how great it will be if it can help them see the world as we do. Thank you.
Ram, a good friend of mine from Nepal, used to ask me lots of questions like difference between the color red and blue, green and yellow, difference between the height of a car and a bus, and on and on and on. These kind of questions used to puzzle me, not in a sense of unknown answer. Rather, I was not able to explain answers properly to him. You may find these questions senseless. What if I say darkness was the only color he had ever seen? His height was the only height he ever truly felt. Yes, my friend, he was not blessed with vision. Like him, there are thousands of people who are not blessed with vision, and there are thousands of people who lose the gift of sight during their lifetime. World Health Organization estimates a total of 39 million people who are blind and 531 million people who have visual abnormalities. Can you imagine how hard the life would be without vision? As a child, I always wondered, what if Ram could see how his perspective towards the life would change, how much opportunity would be there for him and his family. Later on, I had a new friend, Champa. During our period of friendship, she accidentally became blind. Luckily, she could regenerate the retina and get her vision back. Amazing, isn't it? But the contrasting factor here, my friend was a newt, not a human. I, along with the like-minded people, started wondering, what if humans could do the same? Retina is an important part of eye that's responsible for vision. Destruction of retina, either by disease or physical injury, leads to the irreversible loss of a sight or blindness. Current treatment is only able to slow down the rate of retinal deterioration, but none will restore the vision. In contrast, newts, the amazing creature from the nature, is able to regenerate the whole functional retina from a layer of a cell called retinal pigmented epithelium, or RPE. RPE is a monolayer of epithelial cells that has an important role in a visual cycle. What happens is RPE loses its epithelial characteristics and starts detaching from each other and from the basement membrane known as the Bruch membrane. This gives rise to the individual RPE cells expressing multipotency marker. That is, now the cells can differentiate into the different cell types. These individual cells are called RPE stem cells, which gives rise to the pro-neuroretinal cells and pro-RPE cells, which ultimately gives rise to the functional neuroretinal cells and functional RPE cells. In the other word, the newts gets its vision back. Interestingly, adult human RPE also undergoes the similar initial regeneration process, but ends with the formation of scar tissue, some undesirable end product. This can be taken as boiling of an egg. Once the egg boils, to the knowledge of a science, we are not able to unboil it back. Similarly, once it ends with the formation of scar tissue, we are not able to revert it back into the functional retinal cells. As a result, vision is lost forever. So the question arises, what can we do now? RPE65 is an important protein that is responsible for maintaining the visual pigment regeneration in the photoreceptor cells or light receiving cells. So I aim to insert RPE reporter construct in RPE65 gene using the latest genome editing tool, CRISPR. Meet Geeta. She is our companion to unfold the mystery of retina degeneration. I will electroporate the zygote of Geeta with a standard CRISPR solution. This will give rise to the genetically engineered mice pups. Let's assume Musso Senior and Musso Junior are the two pups with the desired insertion in the desired gene. Now, the RPE of these mice will have green fluorescence in these cells, and any cells that descended from these cells will again have the same green fluorescence. As a result, the development of the cells can now be traced, known as the lineage tracing. Activation of the desired gene and inhibition of the undesirable gene, similar to that of the newt retina regeneration pathway, shall be done by using the mutated form of the CRISPR known as the dead CRISPR. This is supposed to create an ideal environment for the development of the retina, as pathways can now be highly regulated and phenotypes can be observed directly. This will help us to unfold the mystery of retina regeneration, opening the avenue for the regenerative medicine to cure blindness. Concluding in a sentence, we are trying to find inner newts within ourselves. Thank you.
How many of you have seen an elephant before? Can you just wave your hands to me? Oh, thank you. You can put your hands down. So we have a great number of people here who have seen an elephant before. So let us assume that we blindfold 4 people here who have never seen an elephant before in their lives, and we ask them to go out and come back and tell us what an elephant is. I'm pretty sure that the first person that touched the side of the elephant might say something like, "Oh, God bless me, an elephant is a wall." And the second person that touched the leg might say something like, "Oh, believe me, an elephant is a tree." And the third person that felt the trunk might say something like, "Oh, an elephant is a giant snake." And the fourth person that touched the tail, as you can see, might say something like, "Oh, an an elephant is simply a long road. So each of them has different conceptions of what an elephant is based on where they touched on the part of the animal. So the same thing goes to the conceptions of environmental crime. So for instance, if a lawyer or an attorney wants to define an environmental crime, it will define it from a legal point of view. It might say something like, an environmental crime is a violation against the environmental law. And if an economist wants to define it, he might define it from a business angle. He might say something like, an environmental crime is whatever you do against the environment that contributes to your own personal gain. So, for a victim of environmental crime, the case may be different. It might define it from a health perspective. So, why do we need to care about conceptions of environmental crime? We need to care because the impact of environmental crime on the natural environment, flora and fauna, ecosystems is often extensive and long-lasting. This crime has also impacted on health of the people. It has caused cancer, in some cases, birth deformities, and so many other health problems. Research shows us that those who live very close to hazardous waste plant tends to complain of high level of stress and cancer and other birth deformities. And for instance, last year we conducted a research on Chemdyne in Hamilton. Chemdyne was a chemical company that existed in Hamilton like 40 years ago. They incinerated chemical waste. But unfortunately, on 24th of August 1979, there was a chemical explosion on the site, which caused spill into the Great Miami River, killing 1 million fish, and then, as you can see, killing 1 million fish, and causing a lot of problems for the residents around that area. So many of the people that we interviewed during this research made us to understand that they traced prevalence of cancer and other birth deformities in that part of region of Hamilton to the Chemdyne explosion. And some of them also told us that lack of a strong environmental law to bring the owners of this chemical company to justice was also the problem. So it is a good point for us to know that environmental laws are supposed to be put in place to serve and protect the people. But when the policymakers don't really understand what the everyday people think about environmental crime, then this becomes a problem. And how will this law save the people in the first place? So, like Zaleski tells us that when we involve the conceptions of the lay people, the ordinary people in the society, when we involve their opinion in making of environmental laws, then it will increase the trust that people have in the people. It will increase the trust that people have in the government. And this will increase the commitment that the people have towards the law as well. Zoll also tells us that when we involve the opinions of the lay people in making of environmental law, it's something like it is their right, because these people are also taxpayers. So it is their right to have a say in making of environmental law. So I will finish by saying this. We all have a story to tell, input to give, an idea to spread when it comes to our environment. But we must choose the right over the confidence, hope rather than fear, and never to heed to our worst impulses, but our best instinct. Thank you.
This is a picture I took in high school many years ago. If you were to write a biography of me by just looking at the picture, what would you say? Maybe I was happy to be away from middle school. Or I was very happy to be finally leaving high school. Or maybe I had probably just had a very good lunch and decided to take a picture with my friend. However the biography would be, it would be incomplete. Unfortunately, this is how the US social studies curriculum is like. Many people have expressed concerns that the curriculum is not representative of minority groups in society. And I'm going to use an example of how slavery is taught in high school to show you how. In 2016, the Southern Poverty Law Center conducted a survey of 1,000 high school seniors and 1,700 social studies teachers. So just to know how much they knew about slavery. They found that only 44% of the students knew that slavery was legal in all the colonies at the time of the American Revolution. They further found that only 8% of the 1,000 students knew that slavery was the fundamental cause of the Civil War. Furthermore, 10 of the most popular social studies textbooks did not adequately say that slavery and slaves contributed so much to the US economy. Also, 15 state standards did not even provide avenues to discuss the subject of slavery. Finally, 58% of the teachers they interviewed said they were dissatisfied with the current social studies curriculum. Moving beyond the statistics, let me tell you about an African-American professor who took students down to South Carolina to learn about slavery. During the tour guide kept calling the slaves servants. And when they asked her why, she said they were simply not allowed to say the word slaves. Now, after this statistics and the story I just shared, you would ask, how can we make the curriculum inclusive of all voices? How about we redevelop the curriculum, and while doing so, invite teachers, historians, educational leaders, and elders from marginalized communities to input their voices. This way, we would have a comprehensive curriculum that serves all, highlights all voices in society. How about we also give students from marginalized backgrounds the opportunity to tell their own stories through activities like sports and art. Like students in my friend's American government class who, upon hearing about the Ohio Innocence Project and what the exonerees went through, decided to raise funds to support these exonerees for them to be able to tell their stories of how they spent decades in prisons for crimes they never committed. And so you'd ask, what can I do as an individual? Well, as you help your children, your nephews, your nieces, and your siblings with their schoolwork, when you go to school board meetings, and in your everyday conversations about the curriculum, ask yourself, which voices are missing? Which ones have been marginalized? And how can I make sure that these voices are heard? And so think about that beautiful picture you took in high school. If I were to write your biography with just information from that picture, how would it look like? Let's not do the same for the US Social Studies curriculum. Thank you.
When my son was about 8 months old, alongside the feelings of joy and wonder, bliss and intense gratitude, I also had some difficult feelings to reconcile with those. Depression and anxiety had crept in and were digging their heels in, and I sought help, but as some of you might know, treatment for depression often takes weeks, if not months. So in the interim, one beautiful day on this campus, I took my new baby and my new camera out on campus in the gorgeous afternoon light, and what happened was sort of dramatic for me. So I had a pretty instant and significant shift in my mental and emotional state. And that day actually kick-started a whole new profession for me. So 10 plus years later, I'm still doing natural light portraiture, professionally, but my son, my baby, who indirectly pushed me into this, inspired me to do this, also grew up to directly encourage me to pursue another passion. So right now I'm a MSW student, hoping to do clinical work. So recently I was in Israel, where I'm from, visiting family, and I met this really neat film editor. And she got me talking, asked what I do, and she got me really interested and excited about marrying these two interests of mine, photography and psychology. For about a second, I thought I had coined a clever term, psychography. So anyway, I did get excited about joining these things. Well, a quick Google search later dashes, many a dream. I learned everything is a thing. Therapeutic photography is a thing. It's been researched. Photo voice, which is when you sort of arm somebody with a question and have them answer that question with their camera, is a thing. And it's actually been around since the 90s. It's pretty common research practice in the social sciences. So, and then of course, every day we engage in social media, and many of us are doing just that, posting photos along with their thoughts. I know I do it. Not sure if my friends love it, but I love it, or love my posts. So what do all these things, right, so there's nothing new under the sun, but the exciting thing was I realized that converging all these ideas and putting them together could be really seminal or could make a difference for an important population. So who really needs our help expressing and processing difficult emotion? Kids. Why? So older kids, they might have the words, but they're too self-conscious to use them directly. They're not going to answer a lame question about feelings, and the little kids often don't have the words. They may not even understand what it is they desperately need to express and process, and they may not even have access to the memory, really. So let's look at trauma, which is far more prevalent than we want to believe. So 2 in 3 kids before the age of 16 will have had at least one traumatic event. We know that approaching trauma clinically, directly, head-on, is often ill-advised. So what you'll see is, since trauma is stored in the sensory part of the brain, not the verbal part, you'll often see sensory modalities. You'll see play therapy, or in this case, sand tray. And then often it's not addressed at all. And what happens there is it might lead to maladaptive behavior, self-harming, addiction, depression, anxiety, sometimes suicide. So it's the opposite of a risk factor, is a protective factor. And all the arts and creative activity is a protective factor. It's pretty well documented. Among others, you can research protective factors. It's pretty great. And so photography makes a compelling one because it's not only the creative outlet in and of itself, the means, it's also the visual narrative that they wind up with is a compelling thing, because they've sort of had a chance to have some control in the situation, and this visual narrative they come up with is a means of externalizing the experience. I'd like to see this used not only in clinical work, and I think it should be in addition and augment clinical work, not in lieu of, but I'd like to see it, parents using it with their kids in schools, classrooms. So I'll walk you through quickly 4 steps. First, you start with a prompt or a question, and it can be specific or it can be open-ended, and I would lean towards the open-ended, and it can be, what does your day look like? What is important to you? What looks the way you feel? And then they'll go out and take pictures, bring back, highlight the one that's most meaningful to them. And then you might ask them to write a poem or a story or a caption. Sometimes my feelings gush out of me and get on everyone. With older kids, you might see metaphor like this. Sometimes they seem calm, but what's underneath is dark and deep. And the last step, 4, is where you discuss and process. So really important here is probing and open-ended questions. Can you say more about that? What would help? And helping them get out what's underneath. So this is really a chance for a child to author their experience, to, as I said, externalize it, but really to name it, and it can be a compelling tool. The other big thing that it's effective at is essentially putting form to amorphous pain. And the best part is it's free, it's right there, we all have it, you don't need a fancy camera, it's literally at your fingertips. And I really believe this is a tool that belongs in the arsenal of tools that we use to work with kids. Thank you.